Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our MASSP Leader2Leader session on crisis communication. I know there's a lot going on this morning as we wait for Michigan's next round of weather to come at us here as we get the last throes of winter. I know those of us who are used to that spring testing always count on one of those days in the middle of our testing cycle, but hopefully we're getting it all out of our system now. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this Leader2Leader session on navigating crisis communication. My name is Tom Leitz. I am the Associate Director for Training and Development for the Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals, and a long time, about 15 years as a high school principal in Utica Community Schools. This training was supposed to be about a week and a half ago. It was on the Tuesday after the tragic shooting that occurred up at Michigan State. As a result of that, we obviously canceled this because all of our school leaders had way more important things to do than listen to us talk. But we also knew that as a result of that, we'd probably have a greater importance on this conversation, given the fact that we're all realizing that we have to engage in crisis communication, perhaps a little more than we ever thought we would or ever hoped we would. And as a result of that, I want to thank MASSP for allowing us to turn this into a Leader2Leader session where we could open it up to anyone who wanted to attend for free and make sure anybody who wanted the great information from our incredible panel today could get it. As a result of that, we shifted to a webinar format. So just know that the chat is active. There is also a Q&A session or Q&A button at the bottom where you can ask questions of our speakers, and we will address those both throughout the this morning's presentation as well as at the end with some dedicated time for that kind of question and answer. The events at MSU certainly changed the ballgame for a lot of things in this state, and we say that even after last November's awful tragedy at Oxford High School changed the game for everybody in this state. And what we're realizing as a result of these series of crises that are occurring is that these are not exigent events anymore. The big ones we hope remain exigent and remain something that doesn't happen very often. But the reality is that every one of us as a school leader is and will face crisis situations as a part of our leadership. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to accept that fact. And part of understanding that is knowing what a crisis is. So on your screen, you should see a definition of what a crisis is. That idea that it's a stage in a sequence of events. And I want you to think about that for a second and understand the idea that a crisis is not a single thing that happens, but a series of dominoes that fall over a course of time, which means your planning for crisis begins long before a crisis occurs, and your response to crisis continues long after that event is either forgotten, memorialized, or been studied. These are not singular incidents or one point, but literally that turning point is the crisis. And your response to it as a leader is going to determine how long that crisis keeps you from doing the things that we need to do to heal our communities and get back to learning. And so that's going to be a part of the theme of our conversation today, understanding those stages of crisis and knowing how to manage it. So I want to introduce what I think is just an incredible panel of people, two mentors in my world of communication. As a master's student in communication at Wayne State, Dr. Matt Seeger was a department chair, now is distinguished professor, has literally written not just the book, but a series of books on crisis communication, including the International Handbook for Crisis Communication, Effective Crisis Communication and Organizational Communication in Crisis, as well as just being one of the generally great humans I've had the opportunity to interact with. Matt is wonderful. We welcome him from Wayne State University. And also we welcome Mr. Tim McAvoy, who is Director of Community School Relations for Utica Community Schools, the second largest school district in the state of Michigan, servicing about 27,000 students and over 190,000 constituents. So when it comes to understanding the practical implications of communication and managing crises, Tim literally was my go-to for 15 years and is still a go-to when I have a question. So gentlemen, thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedules to join us and lend your wisdom to the conversation today. We're truly, truly grateful at a very personal and professional level for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, truly. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by thinking about a couple of scenarios. And in the chat space, I am dropping a link into that chat. And I would like you to take a look at this document. So the document that I'm putting into the chat is going to ask you to make a copy of it. And it's going to give you 3 different crisis scenarios, hypotheticals, that any one of us as building level administrators may have to manage over the course of our career. Take a couple minutes, read those scenarios over. You don't have to respond to all of them, but think about how you might choose one of those crises. Think about what you could have done to manage that crisis before it happened. Either in the chat, or if you don't want to share to everybody, to me directly, please share what you might have done ahead of that crisis to manage it, to build that communication rapport, and to be able to get ahead of the crisis before it occurs. So just take a second, consider those scenarios, and get in there. Did the link not come through? Let me send it in the chat again. As that's being posted, and you're taking a second to read it over, what I also want you to think about as you're considering those crisis scenarios is, what do you want to learn today to be able to better handle these kinds of situations? Because while the crisis level is going to be different with what we have to do, each one of us, whether it's a school closure that changes the way parents have to deal with their day, a threat, a fake threat, as we saw about 3 weeks ago when Michigan dealt with a series of swatting incidents where kids were calling the police saying there was something bad going on at schools that wasn't happening. The same occurred in Oklahoma last week. Or whether you have some sort of issue with a person walking around your campus with a weapon because of Michigan's open carry laws, or whatever the situation is, every one of us is going to have to deal with, address, and recover from a crisis situation. Here's our definition of crisis. One of the questions in the chat was, is this being recorded? This will be recorded, and anybody who's on this will get a copy of this from start to finish. So as we discussed earlier, the sequences of events at which future events, especially for better or worse, are determined, that turning point was the definition that we started with for a crisis. So we introduced our experts and we threw these scenarios up. What we've asked you to do is in the chat, after you've had a chance to read it, now that that link is up, and we'll edit all this fun out so no one has to see our boo-boos, okay? To take a look at the scenarios, pick one, and consider how you might have addressed this before it happened, how you would have prepared to manage this crisis before it occurred. Thinking about those three scenarios, the crash, the disease, and the threat, all very real things that could possibly happen in your school. We also want you to think about what you might want to learn today to better handle these kinds of situations going forward. As we're considering these, we have 4 learning targets for today. The first is to develop an understanding that managing crisis begins with communicating and building trust and rapport. Understanding how your communication all the time will assist you when you get to these moments that are just hopefully some of the time. Second, we're going to define crisis and help you understand what are those moments that actually rise to the level of crisis and need for crisis communication. Then we're going to break down the stages of that crisis communication so you know where you are and how you have to react differently in those particular stages. And finally, we're going to apply that learning to action. So we're going to take these 3 scenarios and we're going to actually talk through how they were successfully or could be successfully navigated. As we're going through this, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. As you're coming on now, if you take a second to introduce yourself in the chat as well, consider those scenarios and we will dive into this. So let's talk about communicating trust to start off, because my good friend Tim McAvoy used to always tell me that as a building principal, your job was to kind of manage the communication of that building to make sure that you were not just responding when something went wrong, but building positive influence within your community, sharing positive stories, doing what you could to build up trust and rapport with your community. Because quite simply, we have a challenge in schools with public trust. There's irony in the data that's on your screen, because this is from a PDK poll, which I wrote an article about for MASSP at the beginning of the year, but it is on the right showing the highest grades in school history. So this is a lot of 2020-21 data. People really, really happy with the fact that schools kept things going during the crisis in the pandemic. But highest scores since this poll started. Yet on the left, while you see significant public approval for their school, you also see a fact that the public does not want their children who are in our schools to come back to work for those schools, because there is a sense of distrust or a sense of concern or whatever that is. We have a trust issue. We have a communication problem where schools and the community are not on the same page that they need to be on. And we've seen those communication problems grow and expand over the last couple of months and the last year. The fights over library books, the way that politics has now become really ingrained in the school conversation has exacerbated or worsened that trust level, right? We're not speaking the same language. We're not necessarily giving the clear guidance that we need to be. At the end of the day, communication for us as principals has to begin by realizing that we're not just communicating to our students and our staff, but that we're constantly messaging, building relationship with, filling our well of goodwill with our students and staff, but also our parents, the broader community, the media who serves that community, and frankly, significantly more people than that. Schools are hubs of their communities. When something bad happens, people come into the school for resources. But when something bad happens, they also expect schools to be the one with answers. If you've not built the communication processes, if you have not set the expectation of where and when people should look for that information, if you have not been out there in front of those situations, they will fill that vacuum with information that comes from others, from other places, other people who are far less informed or very misinformed. So our capacity to build this umbrella of communication that you see on there with a variety of different tools, covering a variety of different topics, is how we begin to manage those crises before they happen. You can't stop the car crash. You can't stop a kid from coming into your school with a communicable disease. You can't stop a threat from being real or perceived. What we can do is build the structures and the confidence to ensure that when that happens, we have the ability to respond to it effectively, efficiently, and with a great deal of circulation and trust. This happens in our conversations on a daily basis. It happens with our web pages and our static communication devices, but it very much occurs within the realm of social media, which is where our students and our parents live right now. If you're not on it, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but that's where they're going for information. It's not your phone calls. Those are 4 hours after they've already read 15 Facebook posts or Instagram posts or Twitter posts about what already hasn't happened, right? And it's mass media. It's developing relationships with and understanding how to utilize them as friends, as tools, and as allies in this process. So to get into this, I'm going to turn this over to the expert in crisis communication. As I said at the beginning, for those of you who are on, Dr. Seeger is a distinguished professor of communication at Wayne State University. He was the department chair for many, many years there. He's literally written multiple books on crisis communication. He was a co-author of both the CDC and NIH communication plans for crisis. Whether they use them or not is a very different question. But Dr. Seeger is the guy that the world goes to talk about communication. We're grateful to have him here with us at MASSP for this Leader to Leader. Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom, and that's a very flattering introduction. What is even more flattering is when your students actually remember you and think that things that you taught them are useful and continue to use them. So I'm delighted that Tom and Tim, both former students of mine, remember me and continue to use what we're talking about. So delighted to have a chance to talk to you today. I just have to note for my own sense of well-being that there's a lot to say here, and we can't nearly cover everything that we need to say within this time frame. We will have some additional resources that we'll be sending out. And if you ever have an issue or a problem you wish to talk about, you can reach out to me at Wayne State University, matthew.seeger@wayne.edu. So I want to talk about a little bit about how we define crisis and go through some of the characteristics of a crisis, and then talk about some of the communication activities we might see at the various stages of a crisis. Now, you've all had bad hair days. The older I get, the more happy I am to have a bad hair day. But the point here is that a bad hair day is not a crisis. And I'm sure you have all managed in your roles, your very challenging roles as principals, talking people down from what they see as a crisis, which you see as a very, very minor disruption. So crisis is really something that is culturally defined based on our own particular experiences, and it's a matter of perception. So if you live in Florida right now, and it gets cold in Florida, and there's a snowstorm in Florida, or as we're seeing in Southern California, that's a crisis. But if you're in Michigan and part of your culture is to deal with snow, that's not a crisis. If you've had repeated exposures to particular kinds of events, that those may not be perceived as crisis based on your particular experience, your particular cultural circumstances. Crisis is also a matter of perception. What I see as a major disruption or a major problem is based on my experience and the kinds of things that have occurred in my life. And that may be seen as different than what other people perceive. A crisis is generally seen as a loss of normalcy. We have some fundamental disruption in what we would think of as the status quo. Relationships are disrupted, patterns are disrupted, routines are disrupted. So there's some sense that this circumstance that we're in, this crisis circumstance, is not normal. And also a crisis, of course, creates physical and psychological harm, both of which are really important. Sometimes we focus on the physical harm, but the psychological harm is also very, very important. The circumstances at Michigan State University, really a significant part of the harm is a function of how people have been affected psychologically. Next slide, please, Tom. So when we think about, conditions of a crisis, we've already talked about perception. A crisis is a matter of perception. And one of the interesting things we've seen in a lot of cases that we've looked at is often we have to convince people that something is a crisis. And, often people don't want to perceive something as a crisis. So we have to actually persuade them that, no, this is something we need to take seriously. We talked about this disruption of what is normal. We also see in a crisis situation two interesting phenomena. One is social amplification of risk, and another is social minimization of risk. So often we see things that are, relatively minor circumstances, at least based on our experience, or minor risks amplified into significant risks. So, what may be a minor disruption, maybe a stomach flu coming through your school, or maybe a minor kerfuffle between students, sometimes gets amplified by parents or through social media as a major crisis, and the schools need to deal with this major crisis. We also have a social minimization of risk, where sometimes the things that are really of concern are not taken seriously, again, based on often the way in which people talk about this through circumstances like social media. So we heard a lot on COVID-19 about how COVID-19 is just a bad cold. It's not something we really need to worry about. It's just a bad cold. Well, clearly we were minimizing the risk of that very, very serious infectious disease. Tom mentioned that, we need to, I'm sorry, go back, Tom. Tom mentioned that we need to fill the information vacuum. If we don't fill the information vacuum, there's going to be rumors, there's going to be misinformation. So one of my pieces of advice to you is to get out early with regard to a crisis, begin to provide all the information you have, and also note what you don't know, so that void is filled and that people don't decide, oh, it's my job to start coming up with explanations for what's going on. We also need to note something called the myth of panic. There is a widespread belief that if we tell people about what's really going on, about what's really happening, somehow they will panic and engage in all kinds of maladaptive behaviors. We generally don't see people panic in crisis circumstances. Generally, people respond in appropriate, responsible ways to a crisis. The bigger problem is getting people's attention, not creating panic. So in general, try to avoid making your decisions based on the sense that if I really tell parents what's going on, they're going to panic. That is a myth. We also see cascading impacts. Clearly, we saw that in COVID-19. All of us in education are dealing with the impact of remote learning for, a year, in some cases longer. It's created significant problems. Supply chains were disrupted. Organizational life was disrupted. So lots of cascading impact. And then secondary disruptions. Sometimes we see copycats in shooting circumstances where people decide, oh, it's going to be fun for me to call in threats now that this happened at Michigan State. So we see those secondary impacts. Next slide, Tom, please. So just a sort of real quick overview. There are two broad classifications of crises. We talk about natural disasters, hurricanes, infectious diseases, wildfires, mudslides, tsunamis. And then, yes, we do have the possibility of tsunamis in Michigan, believe it or not, because of the Great Lakes. But many of our crisis plans, or at least some of our crisis plans for schools right on the or cities right on the shore, do have tsunami plans. But we have these things called natural disasters, which are a primary source of disruption and harm. Next slide, please. And then we have human-caused disasters. We have rumors, management misconduct, plant fires or explosions, leaks and spills, transportation accidents. We have this amazing event going on now in East Palestine, Ohio, which is a really good example of a kind of crisis that can infect an entire community. So we also have these human-caused events. What's important to recognize is that many of our crises are a combination of natural disasters and human-caused events. So it's often the confluence of these things that really are the most disruptive. Next slide, please. So let me talk about then the stages of crisis. And one of the real useful tools for people who are actually managing crises is to understand how these events are going to evolve over time. When I talk to people at the CDC or the World Health Organization, I have to remind them that a crisis has a beginning and it has an end. And you need to think of it in that way. And if you understand the conditions that are occurring at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, then you can begin to anticipate and get ahead of a crisis and be a little bit more proactive in thinking about what you need to do. So let's talk about these three stages. Next slide, please, Tom. So first of all, the first stage is the pre-crisis stage. And we often describe this as an incubation period. This is where something, maybe it's a minor problem, goes unaddressed, unrecognized, and it begins to grow. Maybe it interacts with other factors. And can lead to a disruption. So a risk identification and reduction is key in these circumstances. So risk management, risk monitoring. I mean, you all have your ears out on social media. You're all watching the weather reports. You are all looking at transportation information to see, what's working, what's not working, and where there might be something that's just not going so well, and we need to intervene and manage that risk. Fortunately, we're really good at risk management, and people are really good at risk management at the individual level, and your staff and your teachers are all focused on keeping students safe. And so there's a great capacity for risk management, but we still need to be engaged in this monitoring for emerging risks and risk reduction. The other thing that I just can't say enough about is planning, education, training, and planning. It's just absolutely critical. A plan does not ensure that you will respond effectively to a crisis, but it certainly enhances your odds of being able to do so. Michigan State was able to respond very, very successfully to this incident, in part because they'd done a great deal of planning. They'd done training, they'd run scenarios, they'd run tabletop, they'd run live exercises. So planning. It's, having a plan that is a living document, not a plan that simply lives on your shelf and gathers dust and you're not even sure exactly where it is, but a plan that is revisited with some regularity. and that is operational with other plans. The districts will have plans, but individual schools certainly should have thought about those plans, talked about those plans, and should have their own operationalization of those particular plans. So please, yes.
If I can interrupt for 1 second, and one of the things I want to do just to give some shout out in credence to the work that these principals have done is one of the wonderful narratives, and wonderful is a bad word, one of the positive maybe narratives that came out of this, given the work that you're all doing at the middle school, secondary, and even elementary level, is a lot of these students were not around adults when this happened at Michigan State. And even though they did planning, many of them suggested that the reason they responded so effectively was because of the work that they had done in high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools to recognize what they needed to do in a situation of crisis. So you all deserve an incredible pat on the back for what is, I know, very difficult work to do with our students, because it did come into play.
Yes, it's hard to overstate how important planning is. And, you mentioned, Tom, earlier that, weather happens and threats happen. Bad things happen all the time. Bad things are going to happen. And we need to be planning for those things. We need to anticipate that they are going to happen. So next slide, please. So when a crisis occurs, it usually occurs or is signaled by a trigger event. And this is some indication, maybe it's a call from the press, maybe it's, a call from the local law enforcement, maybe it's notification of from some other agency, maybe it's something that you see specifically happening within your school, but there's some trigger event that says now things are in a crisis stage. Now we have this risk and this high uncertainty and this need to respond immediately. So in the crisis stage, we have the beginning of the accumulation of harm. We also have the need to respond immediately to contain and limit that particular harm. Hopefully, we have our plans and our response protocols in place, and we activate those and we follow those, which helps us mitigate, limit the harm, and shorten the period of harm. That's really important. The longer the harm goes on, the longer the period goes on, the greater the harm that will occur. So our goal in the crisis stage is to control the harm, to limit the harm, so that we can move out of this stage as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Post-crisis stage is a really interesting stage, and it can go on for a very long period of time. One of the things that is inevitable in a post-crisis stage, and we see this in almost all of the bad things that have happened associated with schools, are these questions of blame and responsibility. Whose fault is this? Who are we going to hold responsible? Who are we going to hold accountable? And those conversations are going to occur. It doesn't matter, what you do to minimize or avoid those. They're going to happen, and you need to be prepared for them. We also have activities associated with memorializing and grieving. This can really help with the psychological impact. We had memorials, Michigan State memorials, actually throughout the state. We had one at Wayne State. And certainly that was important to help people get past these episodes and begin to move on, to create meaning around the event, and then actually to move on. We also have action after analysis, which should occur in the post-crisis. This is a process where we think about what worked, what didn't, what we need to do differently in the future. One of the things that's really, really depressing for me as a disaster and crisis researcher is we often see the same crises repeated again and again and again. We didn't learn from that crisis, the earlier crisis, and so we're doomed to repeat it. A crisis should be treated as a learning opportunity, an opportunity to learn and to change. Next slide, please.
Hey, really quick, Matt, before that, and Tim, you're welcome to jump in on this too. One of the parts that you talk about, and I think really well, is when you talk about memorializing and grieving and moving through these stages, even in the last slide about filling that void, you very articulately talk about the importance of being human in the responses to these crises. Could either of you talk maybe for a second about, like why theoretically that's important, but also practically what that does to benefit the school leader who doesn't address this as an incident? But, the famous speech that came out of Michigan State wasn't from the president. It was from Coach Izzo, right?
Yeah.
it was a human response. So if you could talk about that for a second, I would be grateful.
Yeah, he's also a pretty good basketball coach, but he's an excellent communicator. So, it's really important for purposes of credibility for the audience to understand that you share their concerns and their pain and that you understand what they're going through. So expressions of empathy and concern really humanize you as a communicator and significantly bolster your credibility. So we do advocate as sort of a best practice of crisis communication, empathizing, expressing, the loss, the concern that people are feeling, and really, acknowledging the human pain that people are going through. It's a very important part of the response.
I would just add that while we were in the midst of COVID, there were a number of our principals that really effectively used video. And in that video, you could see the impact on them in terms of having an empty school or missing children, missing the institution of school. And it was really those principals who were able to mobilize their buildings, effectively. And people saw them as, not only the face of the schools, but as human beings. And so you don't really have to wait for a crisis in order to demonstrate that humanity. You do it every day, and you can visually do that every day.
Thank you both. With that, we're going to step into the next part, which is really going from that theoretical bent to action, because Dr. Seeger, and he talked about the action steps, but he has laid out a framework for what a crisis is and how that crisis moves forward. And it doesn't wait for us. It doesn't always respond the way we want it to, but the more work we do ahead of time, during, and after, the more likely we are to bend will towards what we want it to be and to be able to manage that crisis in an effective way. So this is where I'm going to ask Mr. McAvoy to jump in. But before we do that, at the beginning, there was a document, and Wendy shared it out again in the tag, in the chat, because for some reason mine wasn't working. So thank you. There were 3 scenarios that I asked you to consider at the beginning. Given what Dr. Seeger just shared, I want you to use a protocol called the 3 C's of decision making. It asks you to clarify your initial response, to consider changes based on new information, because that is our world. Information doesn't stop flowing once we've decided to respond to something, and then choose the way we would adapt to that crisis. So clarify, consider, and then choose a way forward. So take just a minute to reflect on that one of those 3 crises that you picked earlier, and how, based on what you heard, you might manage that ahead of time differently, given the information that you have now. So we'll just take a second. If you're daring enough to share, please drop your response into the chat of maybe how you're thinking about things differently. As you're considering your responses and the way you might have changed, I'm going to turn this over to Tim to talk a little bit through kind of how to put this practicality into action, or how to put this theoretical piece into practical action. Go ahead, Tim.
So I just want to draw on a couple of things. And as Dr. Seeger mentioned, I happen to be very fortunate to be a student of his maybe about 20 years ago, if that doesn't scare you. But I still use a lot of what he taught me. In fact, out of most of my classes, this probably was the most practical in terms of translating theory into action. And so I just have a couple of things that I want to stress kind of based on his purposes. First of all, I want to just put it out there that I don't know a position in the school district that is harder than being a high school principal. And so, the fact that you have time to sit and to think is probably at a minimal. And so I think one of the things that I want to do at least is give you some very basic strategies that you can walk away with to set yourself up for success. And the first is the importance of a year-round. The longer I'm in this job, the more I understand the importance of a year-round, consistent communication from a building, from a school district that will save you in so many ways when you need it, whether it's something that's going on or a true crisis. Nothing is more effective in terms of addressing and going into this than having some sort of strategy in terms of how you communicate with your school communities. And so what I would challenge you to do is to take 10 minutes, close the door, or you could do this at home while you're watching a game or whatever you're doing, and just chart out on yourself how you communicate and two different scenarios on how you communicate. One is list on the left side how you communicate, whether that is phone calls, emails, newsletters, whatever strategy you use. And the top part, there should be two pieces to that. One is who your audience is, whether that is students, parents, community at large, staff. And the other is your timeline. How often do you do that? Do you do that weekly? Do you do that monthly? Do you do that around conferences? What is the timeline on that? And when you start doing that, you will be able to see very clearly where there are gaps, where you need to put in some strategies for improvement. But it also gives you some clarity in your mind. How is it that you communicate? And how is it that people are getting your information? And so the worst thing you can do in times of crisis is start thinking, how am I going to communicate? Your really focus should be on what you're going to communicate. So if you have already kind of in your mind have that napkin or whatever it is you drew that timeline on, that strategy on, your focus is not going to be in how do I get this message out, but your focus is going to be on what is my message I want people to walk away with. And so as Dr. Seeger mentioned, the importance of getting out early, that just saves you an abundance of time in order of how am I going to communicate. So the other piece I think that you need to think about is, next slide if you can, Tom, is I have talked to more principals who hate social media because all it does is it creates problems for them, whether it's a TikTok challenge and you're putting your bathrooms back together or whatever it is, or it's Facebook and there's some crazy rumor going on that you are, firing your entire staff, whatever it is that seems legitimate. Some strategies for principals have been, I'm just not going to deal with it. I don't want to be part of it. I don't believe in it. What I would encourage you to do is to realize that this is one medium you have. First of all, people are going to talk about you whether or not you do it or not, right? So you might as well be the one controlling the information. And the second part is this is one free tool that you have available to you that will allow you to directly communicate with people. And so you are not, whether or not you live there, your families are living there, or your community is living there, your students are certainly living there. And so it is in your best interest. And there are tools available to you so that if you make one post, you post it across multiple platforms, whether that is YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or whatever you choose as your medium. So if you do not have a social media presence, I would encourage you to walk away from here and maybe talk with someone that who does have a good social media background to help you create those tools for you. The other piece is redundancy is okay. So when I started this job too many years ago, the goal was that you created a mechanism for communicating. However, that wasn't you trained people to go there. And you're not that fortunate anymore. You need to believe that people are communicating in very different ways. Some still like traditional email, some rely on phone calls, some are exclusively on social media, some will only look at text. And so redundancy is okay. So if I'm a principal and I'm sending an email through my, with my newsletter once a week, I'm really not communicating. Because if I look at our logs and we say how many people are opening an email, you're probably in that 30 to 40% range. If you send a text that goes along with it, it's to take families, check your email, then you're probably in the 50 to 60% range. So if I have an event or something I want people to be aware of, I need to use every tool available to me. And again, you know, there are people to help you, or there are tools that will help you cross these formats. The other piece is that as you communicate, the worst thing you can do in a time of a crisis, or even if you're getting beat up about something or other, is to stop communicating. And it's a natural instinct, right? I don't want to put people out there because people are going to criticize you. So normally what I've learned is that there is a 90% of people who are waiting for information, or who process information. You have 5% who love you, you have 5% who don't love you. And if you are reacting to those percentage and you're trying to turn those people who don't love you into people who love you, you're really kind of wasting your time. Your target really is this 90%. And the last piece, and I think this is Tom was certainly a walking example of this, is that you are the CEO, and so they need to see you. And so one of the things that Tom did really effectively is every Monday, or it would be Friday, he would do a YouTube message just to his families, and he'd share that on all of his different multiple platforms. And he'd talk a little bit about his family, or some of his own, you know, his own personality kind of showed through. He had this bright orange bow tie that became the hit of the school district from his days at Utica High School. And so if they know you as a person, if you are having fun with snow days, then they will, in times of crisis, they will know you as a human being. And so you just can't turn this stuff on in the times of a crisis. If you walk away from anything, it is think a little bit about how you're communicating and how you're positioning yourself for success. All right, Tom, if you can go to the next slide. One of the things that I learned from Dr. Seeger years and years ago was the importance of legitimacy. And so I don't want to give away a lot of what Tom is going to talk about in terms of some of the scenarios, but in each of those scenarios, there were organizations out there who spoke on behalf of the school district, who had legitimacy, they had credibility. And so when I structure a communications program for our school district, and you can certainly do this at your school, I always look to other people who could speak on our behalf. And so we have a campaign right now called The Value of a UCS Education. And so I have realtors talking about how property values are higher because people live in the Utica community schools. I have graduates talking about how they had opportunities that they would never have anywhere else because of Utica community schools. And that sets the stage for this notion that if you say it, people are going to be skeptical because you're paid to say it, right? It's your building, it's your school district. But if others say it, then it has legitimacy. And so at a time of crisis, always accept those who have legitimacy for those who can support you. And so I don't know that this was a part of what we talked about earlier, but I'm telling you that I have used this legitimacy aspect more and more to greater success, and just about every couple of years. So you have alumni that you can feature who will talk about you. You have business partners who you can feature that will talk about this school district is doing all the right things, and they're going to carry more weight and power than you ever will, because you're expected to love what you do.
So Tim, one, it wasn't just an orange bow tie. There were many colors. Two,
Yeah.
It was every day that message went out. But third, and most importantly, if I'm on this webinar right now, I might be thinking, what does this have to do with crisis communication? Like, why am I getting alumni to come out and talk about what a great school district this is? These guys were supposed to be teaching me about how to manage a crisis. Can you tie that knot for us?
Sure. So all of this in a time of crisis, confidence and knowing you is probably more important than anything else, right? And so if you go into a crisis and you haven't done any of these things, then you're starting behind the eight ball, right? So if people know you, if they are consistently hearing from you, then they have confidence in your ability to manage the crisis.
And Tom also mentioned this when he talked about sort of the well of goodwill. Sometimes we call that the reservoir of goodwill. So maybe it's bigger than a well, but building those pre-event relationships is critically important to be able to respond to a crisis, and then drawing on those relationships as channels to communicate during a crisis. Partnering with credible sources, legitimate sources is really, really important. You also often see this in a crisis where a CEO or a crisis manager will have other groups behind him or her, to support them as they're talking about the circumstances.
Yeah, I'll give Matt one of his lines back that I've used, that it's hard to make a friend in a crisis. And Tim's, I really, a lot of what his conversation is about, how do we make those friends before we need them? Because if you go out and try to find those allies when you're in the middle of a threat situation, a disease situation, an awful crash that's upended your community, you're not going to have them, because everybody's pointing the finger at you at that point. They're not willing to make that risk. So you got to develop those beforehand. But thank you both. Go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
All right, if you can just go on to the next slide. So these are 3 posts that I've done. And so I think when you think about social media, or you think about the impact, and this is just kind of an aside, something I've learned, is that I think because education can be, education is a very dignified profession at times, we forget that it's okay to have fun. And we have that 5% that say, what does this have to do with academics? But I would say that some of the posts, some of the most emotional responses I've had to things that I've shared have been things like kids going outside for a snowball fight at a high school. Just kind of letting go of some things, that it's okay to have fun. So here's 3 scenarios, right? Here's 3 different posts. And all of these we asked people to share, and we did the strategies behind it. We tagged other people. But the one on the left is a bond issue that we have, as well as a non-homestead, incredibly important to our school district. The middle one is a new program we have at Utica High School regarding health and human services. And the one on the far right is this raccoon happened to jump on a windowsill, and all the kids ran to the window, and they thought that was just the most amazing thing. So out of those 3 scenarios, which one do you think had the greatest response? So to give you some perspective here, the one on the left, I had about 15,000 people viewed. The one in the middle, I had about 10,200. The one on the right, I had 104,000 people that viewed that, shared that, liked that, responded to that. And so we should never forget that we are a school, and it's okay to have fun. And if you set that climate, people will again see you as a human organization.
So whether it's a reservoir or a well, you can't draw from an empty one. And that raccoon picture is awesome because it shows you what people are looking at. We've got a couple people on this webinar, Stephanie Livingston, who I follow her tweets, Andy Kwalczyk, superintendent up in Pinconning, does a great job of sharing it. And he did when he was an AP and a principal as well. Amy Hendry is on here, share her building. They're pulling that curtain back to let people in and see what's going on in their schools, and to make sure that those community members don't feel excluded from, but a part of. They feel seen, they feel recognized, and they're building that well or that reservoir of positive intent, right? So let's go back to those scenarios. And Tim kind of alluded to this, right? We have 3 scenarios that we talked about. So Tim, you can feel free to jump onto this too. And Matt, if we did anything wrong, please let us know. And so that, because we're constantly going backwards and thinking about this. So that first scenario, the crash, you got a group of students all in an accident together. They wrecks your community. And I'm talking big community, multiple schools, first day of spring, seniors about to graduate, there are deaths. So that legitimacy becomes the most important piece. The school is not an expert in police issues. The police are. So having that relationship with the police allowed us to get them out in front of these questions and rely on their instant command rather than us. We could repeat what they said because it had legitimacy, it had carrying power. There was collaboration with the press in that crisis situation. We were providing constant updates through social media, focusing on student safety, and at the end, and I can't remember if it was Matt or Tim said this, but reclaiming the focus of what is going on. What do we have to focus on now? The past event happened. How are we moving forward? How are we ensuring school continues? How are we grieving and doing the human parts of it? But in that scenario, if your response is to ostrich and bury your head in the sand and allow somebody else to take care of it, you've lost. If in that scenario you haven't built up that well of human understanding, of relationships, your message is going to be deadened. It's going to be lesser than somebody else's who people perceive they have a greater connection with. If we think about that second scenario, the disease, so a kid shows up to school, they have a communicable disease, tuberculosis. In that case, it's not a police issue. So who is our legitimate source? Well, in that case, it's our local Department of Health, right? I know as a principal, and I know many of you did this too, we relied during COVID on those messages. You can't do this, it's against the law, this is not right. The Department of Health said, the Department of Health requires, right? In this case, the Department of Health will release a statement saying here is the reality of this situation. Yes, it's safe to come to parent-teacher conferences tonight because the school has taken these actions. So now they're validating our process. Meanwhile, on the back end, we're using social media or communication tools, phone calls, texts to say everything's still a go. We've done this right. The health department said we're okay. However, if you don't want to come, we understand that and we'll find another way to make sure you get that conference. It's amazing the power of an option. If I feel like my back is against the wall, I may not do it just because my back's against the wall. If I feel like I have a choice and that choice is informed by people who are experts and informed on it, now all of a sudden I feel empowered to make that choice. And I'm going to probably make the right one and continue on as normal. The third scenario. This was an interesting one, right? If you read this scenario, the scenario got out of control before notification. So, right, rule number one is you're thinking about your plan. Teachers, if you're out there and a kid comes to you with a threat, do not wait for Monday to let me know, right? That communication is huge. It's important. We need to know right away so that we can work with the appropriate officials to make sure it doesn't get out of control, to make sure it doesn't get ahead of our communication cycle. But again, in this one, it's a threat scenario. So we're going to rely on our police and we're going to complement their action with work with the press. And then we're going to reframe, because in this case, as the scenario said, it was not a real threat. It was a perceived threat. It was a rumor, right? Based on some things people saw and perceived. But remember that perception is reality until we shift the reality. So that's where filling that vacuum with accurate information in a timely sense is going to be important. Tim, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just add, again, the importance of having, before any of this happens, an effective or consistent kind of communication strategy in your mind. And so when you think of all three of these scenarios, you don't have time to figure out how you're going to communicate. You're really focused on what you're going to communicate. And I think in all these three incidences, again, it shows the importance of legitimacy and having someone who has legitimacy. Your mission is teaching and learning. The mission of the police department is public safety. The mission of the health department is public health. And so in all of these scenarios, your focus is on your mission, which is taking care of kids. They can speak to their mission and compliment you on your partnership in terms of, especially when I think of the health department scenario, they are the ones that actually sent letters on our behalf. We certainly work with them. And they were very candid with the media that this school district is doing everything it needs to do to keep kids safe.
And I know Matt's about to jump in too. And I just want to say, because we've kind of alluded to this, that these scenarios were not fake. These were all things that occurred within my first 2 years as a principal at Utica High School. So in this case, that building of that reservoir had to happen right away for me to be able to leverage that. And it did, because we used social media very regularly. We used communication to the community very regularly. And even as a first-year principal in that case with the car crash, we had a ton of capacity to get message out and get it out very quickly. I'm sorry, Matt, I saw you unmute yourself to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, working with these other agencies, be it public health or the police department or, other groups, creates consistency of message. And so one of the characteristics of a crisis is very high uncertainty. And if you have everybody, singing from the same songbook or working from the same manual, then you're going to have consistency of message across these various groups, and that's going to reduce the uncertainty that people feel. So coordinating in advance, having plans for how you're going to work with people to create consistency of message is critically important.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Seeger. And Wendy Zadeb posted in the chat and always value her thoughts and expertise on this stuff, having been a principal for a long time at some very high parent engagement schools, is to make sure some of those parents or those stakeholders in the community that are going to give you feedback on whether your messaging is happening, whether it's working well. That's not just in crisis to do that after the fact. Is this working? Whether you're using surveys, whether you're just reaching out through your sounding boards, however that works, know if the message is working, because that old adage of a tree falls in a forest doesn't make a sound if no one's around. The reality is it doesn't. The physics may be there, but sound is a human creation, right? We perceive the meaning. So if no one's hearing it, it doesn't matter whether you said it. That's why that how has to be figured out ahead of time so we know where it is. So a couple of things to reflect on as we're drawing this conversation to a bit of a close, and then we'll have some questions. And I've got one in the chat that I'll let these gentlemen, in the Q&A that I'll let these two go at. But unprepared is your biggest enemy. You have to be prepared, as Tim put it very, very well, of the what you're going to say, not the how. You have to know your parents are in those worlds, receiving those messages, and your community with fidelity, right? Preparation is a big part of prevention, because we couldn't stop that accident from happening. We couldn't have predicted that a student was going to come back from visiting family overseas and have a communicable disease. By the way, he and his family, everybody was okay. But we had to manage that, right? We couldn't know that a threat was going to happen, or when it was going to happen, but we knew it was going to. So preparation and prevention, having that crisis plan, having a process to threat assess students, maybe now more than ever, is really important to have and to be able to look back on and refer to when you have those questions. When you're in that situation, that trust is going to remain only as long as people perceive you as being accurate and timely, that you're identifying the issues, that you're prescriptive in what you're saying. And that's a big risk, right? And that's where getting those legitimizing sources behind you to share their message, rather than it being Tom Lee, school principal, saying this is okay. It's the Macomb County director of the Department of Health that's saying it's okay. Or it's the deputy chief of the Shelby Township Police saying this is safe, right? And then I can parrot that message because I'm going to stay on that message. And I'll give Mr. McAvoy a ton of credit running the communications of a district with almost 40 schools, where any message affects all of those schools, not just one or two. Making sure there's consistency there was critical to reducing that domino effect that happens, right? Because as we all know, a crisis happens in one school. 2 days later, a parent finds out about another school and they start pulling their kids out, unless there's a clear communication plan, unless it's active, it's accurate and timely. And then that last piece is being responsibly transparent. Understanding that these are humans and they need information, they need to be heard, seen, and responded to. So we're monitoring and listening to social media. We're providing updates regularly through the channels that we've established. We're identifying our collaborators and making sure we're sharing that message and what we can, because what we realize that a lot of our communities don't is that we can't share everything, that there are limits to what we're allowed to give and provide. But if we develop that trust ahead of time, that's going to be a much lower grade question. Anything to add to this, gentlemen?
Again, I would just emphasize the importance of planning, thinking through what is really hard to think about. What are we going to do if this really bad thing happens? Is just critically important to being prepared. It doesn't provide all the answers. It isn't going to tell you exactly what to do, but it's going to provide a basic guideline, and it's going to buy you time.
And I guess I would add the importance of staying on message, because it's incredibly difficult to do in the heat of battle, particularly if you've got that 5% that are just trying to drag you off message left and right, and you're reacting to that. You just always remember you're talking to that 90%. And like I said, I think that is probably one of the more difficult parts, is to not make things up as you're going along, to have a consistent message at the beginning that you stay with.
And remember, that messaging is not just you. So that first one on the left with the deadly crash at Stony Creek Metro Park, there were 4 kids from 4 of our comprehensive high schools in the district I was working in. All 4 high schools were impacted. When we got in that Monday morning, my staff had a script that I provided them with what they could say, what they could not talk about, and what to do with those kids who had further questions. I believe that the result of that, and to everybody's point today, a lot of work by those teachers to build huge rapport. The kids knew they were loved and cared for by their teachers, so they didn't feel blown off by some of the responses that I made them do. That by halfway through that first day, we no longer had kids in our crisis center. Things were normal. And even before that, we had 1 or 2, because they felt they were getting the same message. They didn't feel like there were holes to banter back and forth. And then that message, of course, went to parents via text and via messages. And so that outreach happened. Consistency and planning made the difference to take something that was much more challenging in other places than we felt we had challenged in ours. And that helped us later on, because in my school in particular, it became a much more contentious issue as students came back and some other things. And as a result of the preparedness, the accurate and timely response and monitoring, and then going back afterwards to Dr. Seeger's point and looking at what we did right and what we did wrong to make sure in the next step, in the next crisis, we were able to manage that. So let's do a couple questions. I know we're a little bit over. For those of you sticking around, great. For those of you who can't, I totally understand. In the chat, we had a question that said, and Tim and Matt, feel free to jump in, that a challenge with our staff is being sad and angry that they're continuing to have and use debriefing, processing protocols in place for students, and school violence continues to happen. They're upset that society hasn't changed. It's difficult to keep asking them to process those feelings of here we are again talking about a school shooting. What advice do you have or thoughts on that?
So my first suggestion is to acknowledge the legitimacy of those feelings. I mean, I'm angry. Everybody should be angry. We should be, taking action to resolve these matters. The fact that we haven't means that we still have to process these things and do everything we can to keep students safe. But listening first, I always say, the first thing we do as communicators is listen. We spend too much time speaking and not enough time listening. So listen first, acknowledge and legitimize, validate those feelings, because they are certainly legitimate.
I don't know that I have much to add with that, other than I think there are probably positive ways that you can put that energy toward for others. I'm thinking of last week, there were a number of, in our district, painting the rock outside schools green and white, and writing letters to, we had one school that had like 6 kids of teachers who were at state. And so the kids sat down and they wrote letters. And so there are probably positive ways in which people can feel involved. I think probably some of the more controversial, at least in my community, that can be a little difficult because people have different views on what caused this issue. And that just kind of gets you into another issue that you don't want to have to be wrestling with. So I think Dr. Seeger was right on in terms of acknowledging those concerns and providing services at your school for those concerns, but seeing if you can get them into a positive way to handle those feelings where they feel like they're making a difference. Plus, we got, practically speaking, we were able to share some of that stuff on social media, and it got a nice response.
Yeah,
I will say that.
People do for meaningful things to do following a crisis. They want to take some action that's going to make a difference. and channeling those activities in constructive ways, giving them, suggestions about how to manage can be a really helpful strategy.
So
And
to Dr. Seeger's point, we when the Stoneman Douglas shootings happened and everybody was doing the big walkouts, one of the things I looked at my student leadership, and we had built that bond and relationship, and I said, you can walk out if you want to, I will happily join you. But what's next? Like, what is that going to do? It's going to make you feel good for a minute, but that's not putting positive energy into it. And so I sat around with this group of 15 school leaders. I used to get them from the band, from student council, from sports, and try to diversify my group so they could get out and get with the other kids. And what they said was, you're right. This isn't going to do anything, but we can actually do something. So they organized a process by which they asked me and a couple other people to talk about letter writing campaigns to Congress people. So in an afternoon, we filled up our cafeteria with about 450 kids that were interested. Not everybody had to. They came in, they learned about how to write a productive, functional letter to advocate for their beliefs. They then sat across tables from colleagues, because this was when the big should teachers carry, should they not carry debate was happening, and they discussed it. And they got to hear each other's civilly. We created some rules of engagement. Then we had two teachers, one who was known very conservatively, one who was known very liberally, co-ran a voting registration drive at the school to give the kids the ability to get into that next year already ahead. So we gave them a productive way to take those feelings and put them into real action. And the feedback from that was pretty incredible from the kids in the community, because it didn't take sides. It empowered kids to do something with their angst and their frustration and their lack of feeling heard and seen, and they got to do all that. So you can turn these awful negative experiences into ways to do positive beyond just going through those grief processes. Tim, we had a question that was specifically, I think, really aimed to you, and Matt can certainly add to it, but it was, in your experiences, what has worked best to coordinate the communication across multiple buildings within a district?
I feel very fortunate to have the position I have, in this school district, and I recognize that not every school district has a position like this, and so I would say from our standpoint, having a position like this, we've been able to create templates of letters or talking points that, and our principals work together very closely. But we have templates that we provide to our principals in the event of a threat. In the event of like the crash, for the most part, the superintendent was the lead in terms of communicating with families on a broad level. And we were providing talking points to our principals to use with staff and to use with families. And so I think from that standpoint, if you want to make sure that every building is using consistent language, you have to give them that language. From a district standpoint, I think there's some piece of understanding, looking around you when you have time and seeing what kind of issues other schools are dealing with, knowing that eventually they could conceivably come to you, whether that's concerns with curriculum or concerns with some of the other issues that are going on out there, but particularly safety. Knowing that what is happening, your next door neighbor, kids are watching and will shortly be creating the same strategies to disrupt schools. And so just being proactive in terms of identifying, and we're happy to share any of our letters,
I was just going to ask Tim if you would be kind enough to give us a couple of those that we can put in our little toolkit that'll go out to everybody who's on this. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, and the language is carefully chosen and has been time tested, right? They're not the same language we started out with a year ago.
Well, I want to thank, before I go to this slide, thank both Tim and Matt, Dr. Seeger, Mr. McAvoy, for being here today. Your expertise is phenomenal. You are busy men and you took a lot of time out. So we are incredibly grateful as an organization and as a state leadership community for your ability and willingness to give us your wisdom. So thank you so much. For those of you who are maybe interested in other conversations, we have 2 more High School Matters sessions this year. These are not Leader to Leader, so these are part of the series. One will be looking at CTE specifically around some really innovative work being done at Romeo High School around the Ford NGL model and how CTE can be a tool to help elevate learning for all students. And then we're going to end ours out in May with a conversation with one of my good friends, Scott Worrow, who is a UniServe director now for the MEA, used to be the president of the Birmingham Education Association, to talk about how to build bridges with our EAs to make sure we get off to a really great start of the 23-24 school year. With that being said, my email is up there as well as my Twitter handle. If there's anything I can ever do to provide resources or help you out with this, please don't hesitate to reach out. On behalf of MASSP, we really appreciate everybody being here. We hope you all have a very boring couple weeks here and the rest of the year. And we really appreciate your time this morning. So thank you all very much for coming. This was recorded. The recording will be shared with a follow-up email later on in the week. This one, usually we send it out the same day. It might be a little later, so we can make sure we have as many of the resources that we've talked about available to you in that email as well. But again, thanks to our panelists. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.